As the war in Ukraine enters a new phase, British politics has been focused on Boris Johnson and Partygate. Will the Prime Minister be able to persuade the politicians and the country that it's time to move on? Good morning. Labour has been piling the pressure on Boris Johnson over lockdown parties. I'll ask the party's leader, Sir Keir Starmer, if he's ignoring bigger issues facing the country. The Conservative Party chairman, Oliver Dowden, will be here after a wounding week for the Prime Minister as more Tories openly question his future. What next for Ukraine as the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken travels to Kyiv? His spokesman tells me President Putin won't win the war.
Our Ukrainian partners won the Battle of Kyiv. Right now, they are winning the battle for Ukraine.
And the leader of the SNP at Westminster, Ian Blackford, also joins me live. Plus, Kelly Macdonald and Matthew Macfadyen have been telling me about their new film dramatising the most daring and far-fetched deception of World War II. And here to review the papers are Piers Morgan, who's launching his new TV show tomorrow, and the economist Stephanie Flanders. But first, the news with Ben Thompson.
Sophie, thanks very much. Good morning. Voters in France will choose today whether to re-elect Emmanuel Macron as president or replace him with a far-right candidate, Marine Le Pen. The polls suggest Mr Macron is the favourite to win, but it's expected to be a much closer race than their election runoff 5 years ago. At least 8 people, including a 3-month-old baby, have died following missile strikes in the southern Ukrainian city of Odessa. After the latest shelling, President Zelensky announced that the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, will arrive in Kyiv today as the country enters its 3rd month of war with Russia. The Japanese Coast Guard says 9 people have been found after a tour boat went missing off the northern island of Hokkaido. It's not clear whether those found are alive or dead. 26 people were on board the boat when the crew reported getting into difficulty yesterday. Rescue efforts are ongoing. And the British boxer Tyson Fury has retained his WBC heavyweight title with victory over Dillian Whyte at Wembley Stadium. It was watched by 94,000 people. The referee stopped the contest in the 6th round after Fury knocked down his opponent with a right uppercut. You're up to date. That's all the news from me. The next on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Sophie, back to you.
Ben, thank you very much. Let's have a look at this morning's front pages now, starting with the Sunday Times. Ukraine pleas for weapons were rejected. 4 years is their main story. And there as well, President Macron as the French go to the polls today. The Observer, the Prime Minister should go sooner rather than later, say top Tory MPs, and also a story about the Ukrainian refugee plan, which the Observer says is designed to fail, according to an insider. The Sunday Telegraph leads with a BBC story, BBC guilty of xenophobia over Rwanda refugee deal. That is the claim by the Home Secretary Priti Patel, and also a big picture there of Sophie Wessex, a sparkling welcome for her in St Vincent and Grenadines, it says. The Sunday People, Rishi in hot water again. This is about plans for heating his swimming pool at home. And the Mail on Sunday, finally, Piers Morgan. He's there.
That's a good headline.
Yeah, he's
like
there.
That.
And underneath it, get back to the office, which is what Piers Morgan is doing, sort of, or face the sack. This is the call to civil servants who are refusing to return to Whitehall or risk losing their jobs. It says, well, with me to review the papers, Piers Morgan, of course, and the head of Bloomberg Economics, Stephanie Flanders. Good morning to both of you. Stephanie, let's start with you. We're going to talk about, there's stories about Boris Johnson and about Keir Starmer in the papers this morning. Let's start with the prospect of a general election next year, even.
Intrigued by this in the Mail on Sunday. Boris plots early general election to see off his rivals. I mean, obviously, this, as you can see in the headlines today, the last week opinion within the Tory party is shifting radically against the Prime Minister to a feeling that how long could this possibly continue? The prospect of an investigation into Partygate going on for months and months and months, and a desperate desire to just draw a line under all of it. And this is just a nice reminder, potentially from Number 10, that, well, actually a general election might happen quite soon, sooner than you think. And if you were having an election tomorrow, is there really anyone else who could fight for the Tories better than Boris Johnson. That lack of an obvious successor is probably the strongest thing he has in his favour at the moment.
But isn't that incredible that the Tories don't have a single potential option for a Prime Minister who's just become the first leader of this country in history to effectively be convicted of a criminal offence? I mean, it's just unbelievable. But we are where we are. Boris is this slippery eel. That's why I would never bet money on him not being able to somehow come through this. But you do feel like there is a building jungle drum amongst the Tories, and they ultimately will decide this about his future. And I can predict a very messy scenario coming up very fast for him. More fines on Partygate, almost certainly coming his way. The May local elections, if he does get the shellacking that some people think he'll get, plus surging inflation and people really feeling the pinch in their pocket, I think that triple whammy is going to be potentially deadly for Boris Johnson. But this idea that the Conservative Party can't find anybody else than a leader who is so apparently damaged, whose integrity has been so shattered, I find pretty breathtaking, actually. And it does prompt the question, well, what's wrong with you? Where are the rest of the candidates?
Or they're just looking down the track at a pretty unpleasant couple of years. I mean, we know that the cost of living
Which
squeeze.
actually, interestingly, isn't really covered at all in the papers today, is it?
But it's a given that the UK is now really, fighting this cost of living battle, and I think it will be. And we have a story actually in the Sunday Times talks about Colin Rawlings and Michael Thrasher talk about how the cost of living is absolutely number one when they're going into these council elections. But when you look compared to other countries, you've had Boris Johnson bragging about the UK being the strongest economy in the fastest growing economy in the G7. I was in Washington this week. They were bringing out all the new forecasts from the International Monetary Fund, and the biggest downgrade to growth for this year and next year, the highest inflation, the lowest growth of any G7 country next year, and the highest inflation. So
are you saying Boris is saying things that necessarily aren't true?
Well, they were technically true at the time, and Rishi Sunak, of course, was riding that train. But is now, I mean, the senior European official at the International Monetary Fund told us we are facing the worst of both worlds. We have the sort of tight pressures on the labour market that the US has, but the US at least is a bit saved from the energy price crisis. We have the same pressures that Europe is facing on energy.
Despite all this, it's interesting just reading this article about Keir Starmer, which is in the Sunday Times today, and just the sort of scale of the challenge ahead, despite the Prime Minister's situation.
The May elections will be a really good indicator, not just of Boris Johnson's unpopularity, if it exists at the scale that we think it does, but also the potential for Keir Starmer to actually win an election. If the Labour Party doesn't do that well, it'll be a really extraordinary moment, because you're never going to get a more wounded opponent than he currently has. And just one final point about Boris and the Partygate. This attempt by the Tories now to liken it to parking fines, or as Jacob Rees-Mogg said, the DRS system in cricket when you have an LBW appeal. All this, I think, is actually flaming the problem, not dousing it, because I think the public...
Is it flaming? I was going to say, is it flaming it in terms of the public? I mean, does the public not just want to move on from this?
Well, I think some people do, but I do think a lot of people, their minds are going back. As we come out of the pandemic, they're going back to the sacrifices they had to make. And they're thinking that at the very time that Downing Street appeared to be having permanent weekly parties, many of them attended by the Prime Minister, that at that moment they weren't allowed to see dying relatives. They weren't allowed to go and see their mums, their dads, their grandmothers and so on as they were dying in hospital. And when their mind goes back to that, and then they hear, it's just a parking ticket, it's just a cricket decision, I think it's inflaming a lot of anger. And that's why I do not underestimate the drip, drip, drip damage of Partygate here.
Remember, in those council elections, actually, Labour's fighting. The last time these seats came up for grabs was 2018, and they did well. Yeah. So there is also one could quite easily see a narrative that says Labour's coming short. Yeah. People are not wanting to focus on Partygate; they're wanting to think about the squeeze on the standard of living.
Let's talk about the story on the front page of the Telegraph, which is the Russian nuclear missile. It says aimed at the UK, ready by the autumn, and this is Russia's missile that they test launched. We saw it this week. They've called it a present for NATO. Now, Piers, it's quite hard to ignore the fact that you've interviewed President Trump.
Yeah.
You do wonder how different...
For my new show, Piers Morgan, I'm censored on TalkTV tomorrow night.
All over the papers.
8 o'clock.
You do wonder how different it might have been, could have been, if Trump had been president.
It's a really interesting question. I had a pretty fractious interview, actually, with Donald Trump, but also quite wide-ranging. So although we had a few moments where he blows up at me, a massive disagreement about whether he won the last election, I don't think he did, he thinks he did, and so on. Actually, it's an interesting question. If he was still the US president, given his particular way of dealing with dictators like Kim Jong-un in North Korea and with traditional American enemies like Vladimir Putin, would Putin have actually gone into Ukraine? He says not, and he has a real problem with how America in particular is dealing with the Ukraine invasion.
Let's listen to the clip, what he says.
So what would you do right now in Ukraine if you were the president?
Putin uses the N-word. I call it the N-word. He uses the N-word, the nuclear word, all the time. That's a no-no. You're not supposed to do that. He uses it on a daily basis. We have better weapons. We have the greatest submarine power in history.
So what would you say and do?
I would say we have far more than you do, far more powerful than you, and you can't use that word ever again. You cannot use the nuclear word ever again.
It's just about rhetoric, though. Would that have worked?
Well, I don't know. I mean, what hasn't worked is dealing with this in a conventional manner. I mean, I've had a feeling from the start of this that we're just showing Putin weakness in the West. We're not engaging with him, and we're not just not engaging with him. Constantly, the American president, we see the German chancellor now, going out of their way to say we don't want to trigger World War III here. We don't want to do anything to upset him. It's like, really? This genocidal monster is razing Ukraine to the floor. He's bombing maternity hospitals. He's incinerating Holocaust survivors. What is our moral red line? If it was a NATO country, we would feel apparently a moral duty to engage with him. I don't see there's any moral distinction, frankly, other than they don't happen to be at the moment in NATO.
It is true. I mean, I think that the idea that Trump would have handled this better, obviously, you know, he would say that.
I don't know, better,
but
certainly differently.
He,
certainly
like
differently.
President Biden, would also be worried about the cost of energy in the US going up. And he would be facing that double thing. The more you try and punish Russia on energy, the higher the price goes at the gas, you know, for everyone in America. So I think that same tension would be there. But I was struck in the US this week that that coalition, the sort of bipartisanship that had distanced itself from Trump, where the old school Republican Party was back with the Democrats supporting quite strong measures against Russia. You could see that starting to fray. And certainly Trump still looks like the most obvious candidate for the next election.
You must have asked him. Is he going to run? Could he win it?
I'm not going to reveal his answer, but it's a pretty cryptic answer, actually. But I took
so
it.
He doesn't tell you.
Well,
I think you have to tune in.
I think you probably do.
If you tune in at 8 o'clock tomorrow night, so you'll get your answers that you want. No, I think it's very interesting, this battle for the heart and soul of the Republican Party, because Trump remains their #1 poll winner at the moment. So all the polls say if he ran tomorrow against Biden and Kamala Harris, he'd beat Biden by 6 points, Kamala Harris by 11. So the Republicans have to decide, do we want to go back in with Trump? Because I think whoever wins a nomination probably becomes president.
But there is no appetite for foreign entanglements in the US anywhere. No. So, you know, I think the idea that Trump would be so tough on Putin, I think.
Let's just talk about. I want to talk about this. The get back to work, get back to your office. Jacob Rees-Mogg going around leaving these notes. We're here. I've been
early on a Sunday morning.
What do you make of that story?
Look, I think that it's fascinating. It's a great thing for Jacob Rees-Mogg to bang on about, and especially sort of this skewing them with the idea that they won't be able to stay in their Whitehall offices. They'll get sent to Newport or some of the other places that civil service officials have been sent to over the years. But you know, it's a balance that every company, every business is trying to strike. Where you know we now have people working 3 days a week, which is fewer than it was pre-COVID. But it has to be said, all those offices still have to be there for the 3 days. So I'm not sure that you'll get a dramatic change in the civil service from this, but it'll, it's a nice one for him to beat up on.
I can't think of any reason that would make me less want to go back to work than the idea that waiting for me was Jacob Rees-Mogg. So I think as a strategy, this is probably quite flawed. Also, I think we've got to accept the pandemic has changed a lot of people's habits, and I suspect irrevocably, with technology the way that it is, this may have been coming down the track in a few years, but it's been speeded up by the pandemic. A lot of people actually like not having to commute to work. They like being at home. They like seeing more of their family, and technology is allowing a lot of people to do the job. And if they want to do it, it's a difficult dilemma, isn't it, for companies, because you can save a lot of money by not having expensive office space.
But I mean, as in journalism particularly.
Oh, in journalism, you have to be in the office.
Well, you have to be in the office, or you have to be out and about interviewing people. But I think also...
But not everybody does,
the
do
creative spark you get from sitting next to someone.
Yeah, but we work in... Well, exactly. I can see you're feeling it right now.
It's electric.
Bursting through you, coming off me, radiating. No, I just think there are many industries, though, where actually you don't need that particularly. So I think it depends on the industry and depends on the work practice.
Okay. Well, Piers Morgan, Stephanie Flanders, thank you both
Don't
very
forget,
much.
tomorrow night.
Hang on a minute. I was about to say, no, I wasn't about to do that, but I was about to say good luck with your new venture.
I'll be uncensored.
Uncensored, and don't storm off this time.
No,
right?
actually, it's actually Trump that does.
I know, I've seen
Can
the
you
clip.
storm off your own show?
Absolutely.
He's already done it. Yeah.
I'll do anything for ratings.
There'll be nobody left to present it. It'll be an empty chair. But anyway,
It's going to be a cracking watch. I'm going to
okay,
assure all your viewers.
I'll take you for it. I'll take your word for it. Thank you very much. Well, let's get the latest weather now with Susan Powell. Susan, good morning.
Good morning, Sophie. It has been very dry across the UK so far this April, and there's no rain in sight as we look to the end of the month. High pressure to thank for the very settled weather. The high will reorientate itself as the week goes on, and eventually we'll end up with some cooler air. Today, we've just got the tail end of a low across France, bringing a few showers in for this morning across the southwest of England. They will tend to clear away from the Isles of Scilly for this afternoon, and then we are left with a lot of dry weather this Sunday. Perhaps the odd shower for northern England, the Midlands later, southern Scotland, Northern Ireland, but as you can see, they are very few and far between. Cool along the North Sea coast with the wind off the North Sea towards the west with some shelter, highs of 16, 17, 18 degrees. Then, as I said, here's the area of high pressure staying with us through the week ahead. It does just shift a little bit further eastwards through the early part of the week. We tap into some Arctic air. It is set to stay dry. The winds will become a little lighter. Our daytime temperatures will come down a few degrees on the highs we've seen through the weekend. Something to really watch out for, though, is the potential towards the end of the week with lighter winds under that area of high pressure are a few pockets of overnight frost developing, even though we're pushing into the last days of April. Over to you, Sophie.
Susan, thank you very much. Now, Boris Johnson began the week trying to clear the air over Partygate by apologising in the Commons over and over again. But he ended it with questions about his survival, following him all the way to India and overshadowing some of his trip. The chairman of the Conservatives, Oliver Dowden, is with me this morning. And let's just talk first of all about Ukraine, because the Prime Minister last week seemed less optimistic about Ukraine winning this war. He said that there was a real possibility that Russia could win. What has changed?
Well, I think what we're seeing is both changing Russian tactics, so Russian concentrating on the east of Ukraine, and a Russian determination to keep on going and going. And I think that's why it's really important that we need to continue to tighten the ratchet on Russia, whether that's, for example, the 120 armoured personnel carrier that the Prime Minister agreed with Zelensky just last week, or whether it's continuing to increase aid and tighten our sanctions. So the West has to respond in turn, and we're willing to do so. But
you do think now that Russia potentially could come out of this victorious?
Well, that's always been a possibility that Russia could come out of this victorious. We don't want that to happen. And actually, I think what has happened so far in this conflict, it's 8 weeks in now, is that two things I think have surprised. First is the resolution of the Western response, and indeed Prime Minister Boris Johnson has led that Western response. But also, crucially, the determination of the Ukrainians to defend their homeland. So that gives me a great deal of optimism.
Let's talk about these lockdown parties, because that has dominated the Commons all week. If the Prime Minister gets 2, 3, 4, 5 fines, does he have to go?
Well, I think you'd expect me to say this, Sophie, but I can't engage in hypotheticals about this. And I'll tell you the reason why I can't engage in hypotheticals is that I'm not sat in my office obsessing about what fines may or may not be issued. We'll allow that process to happen. What I'm focused on is getting up and down the country, which I have been doing, talking about the Conservative message, whether that is delivery in relation to unemployment being back down where it was before the crisis, or whether that's in relation to measures that we're taking to tackle cost of living, or indeed with local councils, how local Conservative-controlled councils cost less and deliver more. That's where my focus is.
But it isn't really hypothetical, is it? Because, I mean, it's a very real prospect. The Metropolitan Police's inquiry investigation is going on. They are issuing fines. They keep issuing. We understood that some more were issued on Friday. And at what point does it tip over and become impossible for the Prime Minister to stay on?
Well, first of all, I just have to reiterate the point that it's not going to be helpful for me as a cabinet minister. I don't think your viewers would expect me to be engaging in hypotheticals about what may or may not happen. But also I listened very carefully to what the Prime Minister said, both after the fines were issued and to the House of Commons earlier this week. And I think he gave a very clear explanation, and I understand how people feel really hurt and angry about this. And I think the Prime Minister acknowledged that properly in what he said and gave a full and unreserved apology. But I also think you do need to balance against that, first of all, the really good things that he has done as Prime Minister, whether that's delivering the vaccine programme, getting Brexit done, or the actions in Ukraine, but also the challenges we face right now, whether that's national security or whether that's energy security. These are unparalleled challenges. And I actually think that instability and uncertainty caused by a change of leadership would not be in the national interest.
But how serious are these fines? Because the Northern Ireland Secretary, Brandon Lewis, drew a parallel between a fixed penalty notice for lockdown parties, for breaking lockdown rules, and getting a speeding fine. Is that a comparison you would make?
Well, it's not a comparison I would make, and I actually listened to what Brandon Lewis said. I think it was on the Today programme. That's not actually what I took from the interview. I take these allegations...
He certainly introduced the notion,
Sophie,
didn't he? I heard it too.
Sophie, I take these allegations very seriously, and I don't underestimate for a moment how angry and hurt people feel about it. And I think that it's right the Prime Minister gave a full apology. And by the way, I think the Prime Minister understands and shares people's frustration over this. But at the same time, I do think it needs to be balanced against the big challenges that we face as a nation right now.
But the fines that are being issued now for breaking lockdown rules are therefore much more serious than speeding fines, than parking tickets?
Well, I don't think it's going to help commentating on one fine versus another. It is clear, though, that he has been faced with a fixed penalty notice. Everybody knows what a fixed penalty notice means, and he very, very much regrets that happened and has issued a full apology for it. And I thought he gave a very clear explanation as to how it came about, and I've accepted that. And the reason why I've accepted that is because I do think that it needs to be balanced against the very challenging times that we face, the damage caused by instability and uncertainty of changing leader at this time.
But I do think that there are certainly colleagues, and you listen to what took place in the House of Commons last week, there are colleagues of yours who really don't agree with what you're saying. Let's just listen to a few of them and what they had to say.
It is utterly depressing to be asked to defend the indefensible. The Prime Minister should just know the gig's up.
I no longer think he is worthy of the great office that he holds.
I mean, we've got Mark Harper there, Steve Baker, previously supportive. They're pro-Brexit. They've backed the Prime Minister in the past. How long can a Prime Minister keep going on when they've got powerful backbenchers like that who are speaking like that, calling for him to go?
Well, I heard what those MPs said, and of course, I know them well and have a great deal of respect for them. But I just ultimately disagree. I disagree because I think we need a sense of balance against what the Prime Minister has achieved so far. I disagree because I think we need to look at the challenges we face. And I have to say, talking to the Prime Minister, I think he has a real determination to serve this country more. He has more fuel in the tank. And what I've found travelling up and down the country as party chairman this week, I've been all over the United Kingdom, is that actually the further you get from Westminster and Whitehall, the more people are saying to me, well, what are the Conservatives actually going to deliver for me? And I think that's where the focus of the government needs to be. That's certainly where the Prime Minister's focus is and where my focus is.
But at the same time, you are faced with this drip effect of a police investigation, the Sue Gray report, we still haven't seen it. And I go back to my original point, if more fines are issued, the drip effect of that, and how long or how much the Prime Minister can actually take before more colleagues start asking for him to go.
Well, I think in relation to these fines, we just have to let the police investigation happen. I think it is quite a speculation to assume that there'll be more fines issued. I think what people want us to be doing, and this has been reinforced by my conversations this week, is they want the government to be tackling some of the challenges that this country faces. That's why the Home Secretary outlined measures to make sure we deal with the illegal crossings of small boats and all the damage that's done by that. That's why just today, actually, we're saying that we will, just this week in Parliament, get 10 pieces of legislation through dealing with COVID backlogs, dealing with many of the other challenges. And I do know why people feel angry and frustrated, but I do think set against that, we should be focusing on getting on with those challenges, and that's in the national interest.
But it's difficult when even your own backbenchers are talking about it like that. Do you agree with some of your MPs who say that a no confidence vote is a matter of when, not if?
No, I don't agree with that analysis. But again, I think all of this sort of starts drawing us more and more into speculation about what may or may not happen with the parliamentary party, what may or may not happen with the police investigation. And my focus is, as chairman of the Conservative Party, about getting out there with the Conservative message, which I think is a strong one in these council elections. And by the way, we often focus on the national picture. Councils have far more influence over people's lives, and it's Conservative councils that are filling the potholes 4 times faster, they're doing more recycling, and they're costing people less. Crucially, at this time when people are worried about cost of living, the single best thing they can do on the 5th of May is to vote Conservative. That's where my focus is, and where the Cabinet's focus is more broadly is on dealing with all the big challenges we face right now with this unprecedented national security crisis and this unprecedented energy crisis.
But you have this drip effect of all these investigations going on, and what's more, we now have a parliamentary investigation into whether the Prime Minister misled Parliament. This is all coming down the line. How do you draw a line under this? Is a no confidence vote just the only way that you're going to be able to do that?
I think that the way that we draw a line under this is by focusing on the priorities of the British people right now. At a time when we have a national security crisis in the Ukraine, it's essential that we continue our efforts and the Prime Minister continues his leadership and has genuinely been leadership of the Western world in tackling this crisis.
So the Prime Minister is going to be leading...
And also in relation to energy, this global energy crisis combined with the COVID supply chain challenges, it's the biggest impact on people's cost of living for a generation. They would expect the government to be taking action to deal with that. We're not sat in our offices in Westminster and Whitehall obsessing about different hypotheticals. We're focused on the people's priorities.
So you're sure that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, will lead you into the next general election?
I have every confidence that Boris will lead us into the next election, yes.
Oliver Dowden, thank you. Now, President Zelensky has announced that the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken will be travelling to Kyiv today, the highest level US visit since the war began. Before that was announced, I spoke to Mr. Blinken's spokesperson, Ned Price. I asked him if he agreed with Boris Johnson's assessment on Friday that there is now a realistic possibility of President Putin winning the war.
Well, what we have seen from our Ukrainian partners is nothing short of victory on the battlefield. I think it's important to note that our Ukrainian partners won the Battle of Kyiv. Right now, they are winning the battle for Ukraine. And it's really no surprise because they are fighting with grit, with determination, with tenacity, but also with massive amounts of security assistance that the United States and some 30-odd countries from around the world are also providing. I think what the Prime Minister was referring to, and this is the same point we've made, is that even as we continue to see our Ukrainian partners emerge victorious in key battles, we're going to see setbacks. We're going to see additional atrocities. We're going to see additional brutality. Unfortunately, the Kremlin has demonstrated that there is no low to which it will hesitate to stoop in the conduct of this war.
Does victory mean they take back the Donbass region, Crimea as well?
This is going to be a victory for Ukraine. It is going to be a strategic defeat for Russia. However, and whenever that happens, we are confident of that. Now, our Ukrainian partners are willing to engage in dialogue in good faith with their Russian counterparts about bringing this needless violence to an end, bringing this war to a conclusion.
President Zelensky says that if you had sent heavier offensive weapons from the start of this war, Ukraine could have won the war by now. Are you committed to sending them enough heavy offensive weapons to get every Russian soldier off Ukraine's territory?
What we have done is send precisely what our Ukrainian partners need to fend off this Russian aggression. And I think you see that over the course of this war, the type of assistance we provided has changed. That's because the dynamics of the battle have changed. Now, Russia's been forced to regroup, to reposition, and really to change its strategy. And so they are focusing on the south of the country, on the Donbass, in the east. And so we're providing them, and you just saw another tranche of security assistance we announced announced weaponry. We announced yesterday in the form of $800 million in security assistance. We're providing them just what they need for this new type of battle, the battle that's going to emerge in the Donbass and in the south. We are confident that with our continued support, with the determination and tenacity that our Ukrainian partners have demonstrated, they will emerge victorious there as well.
How long do you think it will be before this conflict does end?
Our goal is to bring this conflict to a close just as quickly as we can, and that is why we're continuing to support our Ukrainian partners, why we're continuing to impose these massive costs on the Russian Federation.
Do you think Ukraine should consider giving up parts of the south, parts of the Donbass, in order to bring this war to a swifter end?
These will be decisions that only the Ukrainian people, through their democratically elected representatives, will be able to make. So our goal is to position President Zelensky, to position his administration to be in a strong position as they engage with the Russians. But ultimately, that's not for us to decide.
We've seen what the Russians did in Bucha, in Borodyanka. How much worse do you think it will be in Mariupol?
We have, unfortunately, every expectation that we're going to continue to see these types of atrocities, precisely because we know that this is not the work of a single soldier or even a single battalion. This was a concerted campaign, and is a concerted campaign on the part of the Kremlin to brutalize the Ukrainian people in an effort to try to intimidate them, to cow them into submission.
We saw images this week of a new missile that the Russians have just tested, nuclear capable. It can travel 6,000 kilometers. President Putin says it's capable of overcoming all modern means of anti-missile defense. Would we know if he was about to use it, or could he launch an attack by surprise?
Well, I will just say this. We have excellent intelligence. We have excellent intelligence from our own assets, but also we have intelligence sharing relationships with countries around the world, including, of course, our closest intelligence partner, the UK. In the case of this ICBM test launch, the Russian Federation notified us through standard procedures under the existing New START treaty. It was not a surprise to us. It never posed a threat to the United States or any other country, but we're continuing to watch very closely in terms of their strategic assets and their tactical assets inside of Ukraine.
We saw President Putin on Thursday in a public appearance. He was gripping a table. A lot of speculation about the state of his health. He sat there for 12 minutes gripping that table without taking his hand off. Do you have any intelligence about the state of his health?
Well, I can't speak to intelligence, but what we're watching very closely is what President Putin does. We've heard a lot of bluster emanate from the Russian Federation. A lot of it has been the height of irresponsibility, especially loose talk of nuclear weapons or other forms of weapons of mass destruction. But we have made very clear that there will be profound consequences for any such action, any use of weapons of mass destruction. We've made clear it would not only be a response on the part of the United States, but the international community would come together as well to make very clear this is not something that will be tolerated. It's not something that we would tolerate.
Ned Price, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sophie.
Well, listening to that was the leader of the Scottish National Party's Westminster group, Ian Blackford. Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us.
Morning, Sophie.
Interesting listening there to his comments about President Putin and his nuclear arsenal, the threat from that. Is it really the time right now to be talking about removing the Trident nuclear deterrent from an independent Scotland?
Well, the point is, I think people have said over many decades that having nuclear weapons was a deterrent. I think everything that we see today, that you've got someone that you don't know if they're prepared to press that button or not. Sophie, there's been a massive missed opportunity over the course of the last decades, because we should have been getting round the table with the Russians and others and making sure that we were reducing the threat from nuclear weapons, reducing nuclear warheads. We're in a very dangerous situation. The world is very unstable. We're dealing with the situation in Ukraine. We need to make sure that we never, ever, ever are in a situation that anyone is prepared to use nuclear weapons. That threat of mass destruction that would take place. Having nuclear weapons isn't a protection. Having nuclear weapons makes us a threat. And we've had a long-standing position that having nuclear weapons on the Clyde is something that we cannot tolerate.
But getting rid of them is an ambition. I mean, if you were to get rid of them now, if you talk about removing that nuclear deterrent from independent Scotland, are you not at more risk, given the position that President Putin is in right now?
Look, I think at the end of the day, an independent Scotland, with that desire to remove nuclear weapons from our soil, presents an opportunity for other nations to get round the table and to negotiate reductions in nuclear warheads. This doesn't protect us.
You're not going to be getting President Putin round a table right now.
Well, we are in the position. We're in the position that we are in today because there's been an effective lack of leadership in reducing nuclear warheads over the course of the last few decades, and that's what needs to be tackled.
But we're having to deal with the situation that we have now, and removing nuclear weapons, removing the deterrent right now. That's my point.
Well, look,
is it a good time to do so?
If you put this in a broader context, and I think it's interesting seeing what's in the Sunday Times today about the lack of preparedness, the lack of support for Ukraine over the last few years. We've been asleep at the wheel and we haven't tackled Russian aggression. I mean, I was on the Intelligence and Security Committee that was responsible for the Russia report, and we simply have not done what we should have done to make sure that we were dealing with that Russian threat. And it's the lack of ability of UK governments over a number of years that put us in the position that we're now in. It's that lack of leadership, and we all must feel the pain and the anguish of our friends in Ukraine that are bearing the brunt of the Russian attacks. These mass graves that we're seeing around the country, and of course the nuclear element is part of this, but it's lack of ability to control Putin that's got us in the position that we're now in.
Are you comfortable governing Scotland in partnership with a party, the Scottish Green Party, that actually wants us to withdraw from NATO?
The SNP position is very clear, that we wish an independent Scotland to be part of NATO. We stand shoulder to shoulder with our allies.
So how do you square that with the party that you're governing with?
Well, the fact is, what we want to do is to make sure that we give leadership to the people in Scotland. We've had an SNP government, of course, since 2007. There's a very clear position that we have as a party that an independent Scotland wishes to be part of NATO. I had parliamentary colleagues that were over in Brussels meeting with officials from NATO this week, so there is no question that our future, our destiny, is to be an independent country within NATO.
Talking of independence, is the SNP government going to hold the independence referendum next year?
This is about democracy, and it's about the election to the Scottish Parliament last year. So ourselves and the Greens had a manifesto commitment of delivering an independence referendum. The First Minister has reiterated that in the local elections over the course of the last few days.
And when's it going to be?
Well, our intention is to have a referendum in the first half of the Scottish Parliament, which means before the end of 2023. But, you know, this is a question for Boris Johnson and the Conservative government. Will they respect democracy? Will they respect the rights of the Scots who sent MSPs to the Scottish Parliament with a mandate to deliver that independence referendum?
So we can expect a referendum next year? That is your intention? That is what you think will happen?
We have been given a mandate by the people of Scotland in that election last year, an independence majority in the Scottish Parliament. It is the right of the people of Scotland. And of course, you know, everything that we're facing at the moment, the cost of living crisis, the fact that we have a government in London, Boris Johnson's government, with no moral authority, the fact that we're facing the cost of living crisis, but of course at the root of all of that as well, the cost that we now have with Brexit as well, there has to be a better way forward for an independent Scotland, and that is giving people that choice.
You have been extremely critical, as we know, of Boris Johnson breaking his own COVID laws. Why was it any different when Nicola Sturgeon broke her own rules by not wearing a mask in a barber?
I don't think anybody would equate what was a momentary lapse, which of course the First Minister has apologised for when she was invited into a barber shop. But let's be clear about this. What we're facing is a Prime Minister that has repeatedly lied to the House of Commons, that broke his own laws and has been found guilty, has been fined by the police. The first Prime Minister ever in office that has been found guilty of transgressing.
So it's different because she only broke her rules once, and because she only broke them briefly.
I don't think anybody would see any equivalence between what has happened with Boris Johnson and what has happened with the First Minister, because it's been a culture of partying which has taken place. And it's the real anger that people feel right across these islands, that people couldn't be with their loved ones, they couldn't be with them when they were dying in hospital, they couldn't visit them in care homes, couldn't have funerals, and yet the Prime Minister in London was presiding over a regime where there weren't just one party, there were multi-parties. The party that took place the night before the Queen buried her husband. And it's about that moral leadership that we expect to see, and a failure of the Prime Minister to recognise that he now no longer has that moral authority to lead.
Ian Blackford, thank you. Now, at the height of the Second World War, a plot was devised to mislead Hitler about the Allies' plans to invade Italy, involving a dead body, a submarine and a fake identity. Operation Mincemeat remained top secret for years, but a new film has recreated the events that made the mission a vital part of the Allied assault. Two of the film's stars, Kelly Macdonald and Matthew Macfadyen, talked to me recently about this audacious true story.
In 5 weeks, 100,000 British forces will strike Sicily's southern shore.
Unfortunately, the Nazis know of our intentions. So we're going to play a humiliating trick on Hitler.
So the idea is to create a fictitious agent, a dead body, and they get a corpse from a London morgue and they give him an identity as a Royal Marine.
And they plant papers on his body. He's meant to be a dead airman.
That's right.
And so they planted all sorts of wallet litter, they call it, you know, things on his person to tell a story that is false.
That's right. And they take this corpse and they put him in a canister and they drive to Scotland, put him on a submarine. And the submarine goes just off the coast of Spain, which then was...
I feel like you're making this up right now.
I know, I may well be. And they let the body go from the submarine off the coast of Spain, which was then a neutral country, but sort of sympathetic to the Axis powers, and also crawling with spies. So they knew this body would be intercepted by the Germans in an attempt to fool them into thinking we were going to invade Greece, when in fact we were going to invade Sicily.
And it was obvious that it was going to be Sicily, so it had to be quite compelling.
A corpse carrying fake documents.
Given the fascist network there, we could quite literally float the documents right into enemy hands.
Prime Minister, that's too big a risk. The fate of the world is at stake. The plan is highly implausible. So when can it be ready?
Well, what say we start with the easy part and find ourselves a corpse?
I mean, the pains, the lengths they go to in order to do this. Churchill in the film says that the idea is so ridiculous, so preposterous, that it has to be utterly foolproof, this.
I think that was a problem they weren't expecting, finding a dead body that would, you know, fit the criteria for to be a drowned airman was actually really, really hard. So before they could do anything, they had to get this dead body.
And also there were all sorts of practical issues about keeping the corpse. They had to keep him on ice so he didn't decompose too much and all the rest of it, and they had to sort of dress him, and my character in the film wears his uniform to sort of wear it in before it goes on to the body, and all these sort of quite macabre details.
And then there's a backstory as well, isn't there, which is where you come in. You're part of the love story that is created around him.
And is he happy? Is he a happy man?
He wants to be.
On the corpse, so that this character, actually, the Germans would believe it.
Yeah, so my character, Jean Leslie, is based on a real secretary in MI5, and to be part of this group was kind of like a really coveted thing. The women in the office heard that they were looking for a photograph that could be the girlfriend of this dead airman. Jean Leslie had this picture and it was just perfect. It was quite personal.
But they get very, very invested in it, much like, I don't know, there are correlations between actors getting into the roles and talking about, they become quite proprietorial about this fictitious man's relationships and interests and all the rest of it.
Like he's a smoker and he's in a bit of debt, you know.
Right.
There was a letter from a bank manager, I think.
Right.
And
there's a great line in it, though, about how the fate of the world depends on a corpse and a donkey cart. The donkey cart being where they pick the body up in Spain and they take it to and hope that it then ends up in the hands of the Germans. But it was such high stakes, wasn't it? Because lives of tens of thousands of men depended on this. And they didn't really know until the very last minute whether the operation was going to be a success.
No, they're all in a dark building in London, and at a certain point they've done all they can do, and they just have to wait and see if it works.
You really don't know whether or not this plan is going to be a success or not.
I may vomit.
Kelly Macdonald and Matthew Macfadyen there, and Operation Mincemeat, based on the best-selling book by Ben McIntyre, is on general release across the UK. Now, the Labour leader Keir Starmer has been repeatedly challenging Boris Johnson over number 10 parties in the Commons this week. The Prime Minister accused Sir Keir of being stuck in a time warp. He joins me now. Good morning.
Good morning.
What is more important to the country right now, parties, lockdown parties, or the cost of living?
For millions of people across the country, it's the cost of living. What they've seen is their energy bills going up just a few weeks ago, and this month they get increased taxes in national insurance. And because local elections are on across the whole United Kingdom, I'm spending the whole of my time, when I don't have to be in Parliament, across the country, and that is the single #1 issue for so many people, and they're really struggling to pay their bills, and the response of the government in the spring statement was woeful. They've made a bad situation worse. They've chosen to add additional taxes, the wrong tax at the wrong time. And in addition to that, they're not even chasing some of the losses in fraud, and £11.8 billion worth has been lost, and they're not chasing that. So for many people, it's the cost of living.
So given all that, why did you spend all of last week talking about lockdown parties and the fine that the Prime Minister has been received?
Because the Prime Minister got a fine. We only had a statement on Tuesday in the House of Commons from the Prime Minister because he received a fine. I didn't initiate that statement. I was glad he made it. But I want to talk about the cost of living crisis because I think the situation is... I've spoken just in the last week or two to a pensioner with mobility problems who told me that she daren't even put the central heating on anymore. She's so worried about the bills. And the government's response has been utterly woeful. They did nothing in the spring statement for millions of people.
If you want to talk about
They're now increasing tax on them. I think we need an emergency budget, and I'm calling on the government for an emergency budget.
Why didn't you talk about that last week? I mean, that's why I'm asking, because last week, it was Tuesday, you talked about the Prime Minister about parties. Prime Minister's questions, you had the chance to talk to him again. It was all about parties. Thursday, you were up in Parliament again. It was all about parties. Why are you not talking about that? Why are you focusing relentlessly on parties?
Well, I want to talk about the cost of living, and I'm very happy to talk about the cost of living. Yeah. Well, as I say, why were we in Parliament on Tuesday with the Prime Minister? Because he got a crime. He got a fine. I do want to concentrate on the cost of living, but if you or anybody else think that I'm not bothered by standards in public life, that it doesn't matter that the Prime Minister has broken the laws that he made, that it doesn't matter that his authority to lead the country is shot through, that it doesn't matter that his own MPs now, as we saw on Thursday, don't really want to defend him because they're sick of defending the indefensible, then I'm sorry, I'm not going to shy away from that. But yeah, this morning, what we're calling for is an emergency budget to deal with the cost of living crisis. And I'm very happy to tell you what I think should be in that budget, because for millions of people, this is a real struggle as they see practically all their bills going up, their wages are not going up, and this month they're being caned with further tax from this government.
There are people who have really had enough of talking about parties and hearing you talking about parties and politicians talking about parties. There are also people who will be watching this and thinking that some of these fines are a bit excessive, like the Chancellor, for example. He walked into that cabinet room, didn't he? June 2020, he was expecting to go to a meeting. He found people in there celebrating the Prime Minister's birthday. It was an event he hadn't planned. It lasted a few minutes. He didn't drink any alcohol. You will remember, you and I talked about a photograph of you in Durham when you were drinking beer at a constituency during a constituency meeting in Durham. That was at a time when those sort of gatherings were not allowed under the law. Do you think that it's that different?
Well, I don't know the details of what the Chancellor was up to. I don't know what he said in his questionnaire in response to the police, so I'm not in a position to comment on that. I do know that over 50 fines have been issued in relation to what went on in Downing Street. That is extraordinary. It's probably the most fined workplace in the whole of the United Kingdom. And we're not at the end of these fines yet. But I'm sorry, on this question, because a number of people have challenged me on this, said, look, Piers, what's the difference between this and a speeding fine? Get everything in proportion. And I tell you, in all my days, nobody has ever broken down in front of me in tears because they couldn't go 35 in a 30-mile-an-hour zone. People have broken down in front of me in tears because they couldn't do what they wanted to do because of the rules. Just let me finish this point, because it's the raw human emotion is the reason I think so many people feel so strongly about this. People missed funerals, they missed marriages, they missed the birth of their own children. But every family, in addition to that, had something that they didn't do. You visiting an elderly relative.
Absolutely.
So just pretending that it doesn't really matter when millions of people made a sacrifice.
But I'm just asking you about the comparison between the Chancellor and the fine that he got and the time when you were in Durham, you were drinking beer. It was during the local elections. You stopped, you were working briefly, you had food and beer with colleagues, which actually under the law at the time wasn't really permitted. And I'm just wondering whether it is you feel lucky that you didn't get a fine.
Sophie, I don't accept that. I think last time I was on your programme, or the one before, you put the same question to me 7 times on this, so we did it pretty extensively.
I'm not sure about 7, but yes.
Well, whatever. The police looked into it. That's the end of it. I've got nothing to add. There's no equivalence. There's no way of suggesting that 50 fines in Downing Street. The Prime Minister
I'm just talking one specific one for the Chancellor, not 50.
They have been found to have broken the law, the criminal law at that. No other Prime Minister in the history of our country has ever been found to have broken the law in office before. And I don't think we can just pass over it. It also means that he's coming to the House of Commons to make statements about Partygate when he should be coming to make statements about the cost of living. I would rather the Prime Minister brought forward, or the Chancellor brought forward, an emergency budget, because for millions of people struggling to pay their bills, what they want is more action from the Prime Minister and from the Chancellor on this. I'm desperate to persuade the government to have a windfall tax on oil and gas companies in the North Sea to reduce people's bills by up to £600. That's one of our proposals. I want to have that discussion with the government. I want that to be what we're talking about in Parliament.
At the beginning was you could have been doing that last week. You did have 3 occasions in Parliament when you could have been talking about that, and you chose to concentrate on lockdown parties. Can I also talk...
That's just wrong. I mean, the statement on Tuesday was... Prime
Minister's questions.
Well, you know, we made... Why, I don't think anybody could accuse me of not concentrating on the cost of living in PMQs in the last month after month after month. But why are we talking about this? Answer, because the Prime Minister has broken the rules he made and been fined by the police for doing it. No Prime Minister in the history of our country has ever been in that position before. So he's brought this on himself. His moral authority, his authority to lead is shot through, and his own side have now had enough of defending him.
Let's talk about Rwanda. The Archbishop of Canterbury said that the plan to send some asylum seekers from the UK to Rwanda goes against the nature of God. Do you agree?
Well, when you've got the Archbishop of Canterbury and Theresa May telling you your plans are wrong, then I think the government should stop and think again. But let me be
Are they
clear.
Wrong morally?
Look, I don't think these plans will work. I think they're going to cost a fortune. We've seen in the past that similar plans don't work. And I think the Archbishop of Canterbury and Theresa May are absolutely right to criticise them. But what I will say is this. I don't want to see anybody making that perilous journey across the Channel. I do want action that stops that, of course I do. I also want to come down very, very hard on the criminal gangs that are perpetrating
I'm going to ask you about that in a minute, but what I just want to clarify, because Yvette Cooper said it was unethical, do you think it is morally wrong what the government is suggesting?
Well, I do think it's unethical, but I also think it's unworkable. I think it's going to cost a fortune. I also can't help feeling, I'm afraid, that there's a bit of distraction tactics in this to stop everybody talking about the wrongdoing of the Prime Minister and the cost of living crisis. But it is important, I think, for me to say this, because when I was Director of Public Prosecutions, I was involved in international operations to deal with people trafficking and to deal with the running of drugs and guns. So I know how these operations work. I want those gangs brought down. They're only going to be brought down by international operations where we cooperate across the world at every point along the journey, from where desperate families get hooked up with these criminal gangs that then exploit them all the way through the journey until they get to the north coast of France. And that's the action I want to see the government taking.
And you've talked about getting more safe and legal routes so that people can come here. But I don't understand how that actually works. If, for example, you have a man from Vietnam who has travelled all the way to Calais, he wants to come over, he's planning to come over in a boat. You don't want them to come over in small boats, it risks their lives. What does he do? How does he get this safe and legal route?
Well, I've been in those camps on the north coast of France and seen the desperate situation that people are in. I've seen children, the same age as my children, in tents in those camps in the most awful circumstances.
Do they do?
What I would like to see, in addition to the international operations to take these gangs down, which I do think is the #1 priority, what I'd also like to see is more support in those camps so that people understand where they do have rights to go to other countries or to apply in France or somewhere else. Because what you see in those camps is the human misery of people who are tied to criminal gangs, and they need the support to help them go through safe and legal routes.
I'm just really interested in the practical solution, though. Are you talking about having centres in Europe where people can go and apply to get the safe and legal route?
Of course you could do that, of course.
Where?
Well, you could do it along the route, but the best place would be the nearest place to the country that they're fleeing from. I mean, but we have set up schemes for Ukraine. We've set up schemes for Afghanistan. I admit the government was behind the curve here and did it in the heat of the moment too slow. But I'm sorry, I don't accept the proposition that it's simply not possible to have a better system than the one that we've got. We also know that the time it takes to process asylum claims in this country now has gone through the floor. We're doing, I think, only 50% of the cases we did 5 years ago. It's taking forever. So there are plenty of things that we could do. For my part, I would start with those international operations to crack down on these criminal gangs. I've seen how that works.
But until
I know how that works.
Until there is a clear plan and a clear idea of how a safe and legal route would work, where people would have to go, how they would apply, it's not going to deter people from coming to the coast, is it?
Well, what will deter people, what will deal with this situation is cracking down on those criminal gangs, because they're taking money to exploit people on very dangerous routes across the world where people are very often fleeing for various reasons from their country of origin. You have to, if the Home Secretary came up with a strong plan to crack down on these gangs across the world, then we would support it.
Can I ask you about Jeremy Corbyn? He did an interview this week. While he was Labour leader, he said NATO should reduce its presence along Russia's borders. He said that he couldn't say if he would come to the aid of a NATO ally if it was attacked by President Putin. What does it say about your judgment that you campaigned to make him leader, for him to become the next Prime Minister?
Well, the first thing I'd say is the position of Jeremy Corbyn on NATO and my position are very, very different. I went to Brussels just the other week to see the Secretary-General of NATO to talk about the situation in Ukraine and to make absolutely clear the Labour Party's unshakable support for NATO. Labour was, of course, Ernest Bevin, the Labour Minister, was the politician who signed the treaty for NATO on behalf of the United Kingdom. So I've been very, very clear where the Labour Party under my leadership stands.
As has Jeremy Corbyn on his attitude to NATO.
When Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, we maintained a pro-NATO position, not least because of those of us in the party arguing for that position. So the Labour Party position never changed on NATO. It's been a very important part of our defence and our security for many, many years. We were there at the start when NATO was set up, and we're there very strongly now.
Given his views now, do you look back and think that you were wrong to campaign for him in the way that you did?
I think I was right to argue through those years and in the 2 years or so that I've been leader about the importance of NATO.
I'm talking about him.
Well, we as a party never shifted our position on NATO.
And that's because to campaign for him, given the views that he held.
Well, the Labour Party position at the last election was pro-NATO, as it was the election before and the election before that. And I don't think I could myself be clearer than I have been about our support for NATO.
Will he ever be a Labour MP again?
Well, you know, it's very difficult to see how that situation can now be resolved. He lost the whip because of his response to the Equality and Human Rights Commission in relation to anti-Semitism. I made it very clear. First thing I said as Labour Party leader, that I was going to tear out anti-Semitism by its roots in our party. I've also made it clear that our position in the Labour Party is not to accept the false equivalence between, you know, Russian aggression and the acts of NATO.
So that's basically a no. He will not be a Labour MP again.
Well, I'm very clear on my positions on those two issues. Very, very clear.
Sir Keir Starmer, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that is it from us for today. Thank you for watching. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Goodbye.